So in the previous chapter, we've been using the Setup Tracking Scene button to do everything for us, to create the render layers, to set up the composite and all that stuff. So now I want to show you how to do that from scratch. So I have my objects here and these cubes and the camera and everything is ready to go. But of course, if I now hit render, what you see is just this. So you don't have the footage in the background. Instead, there is some gray color, and well, that's not what you want, of course. So, of course, we have to first go to the compositing and set up our node tree. So let's go to the compositing layout and then add a viewer node just so that we can see what we are doing, and Control-Shift click on that. So that is our render result. So, of course, we are missing the movie clip. So press Shift-A, input, and then use the movie clip. Now Control middle mouse button to zoom in, and there we've got the movie clip. Control Shift click on that, and you see it's a lot bigger than here. So first of all, just like in the previous chapters, we can just use the scale node. So set the scale node to render size, bring that in here, and that scales it down so that we can now combine that with the render layer. Now combining this footage with our render layer is done by using an alpha over node. So press Shift A, then go to color and then use alpha over. Then we've got our two inputs again. So that is the first input, that is the second input, and the result of that looks a little bit weird. So the background is again much brighter than before, and that is simply because we didn't use convert pre-multiply yet. So when you make that bigger, then you see you can enable this checkbox convert pre-multiply, and that fixes this issue. But it also gives you a new problem, and that is if you zoom in with Alt V, then you can see that here is a little, really a very tiny dark outline around these text objects. And that is because of a problem with oversampling and this pre-multiplication. Maybe let's first have a look at what pre-multiplication is. So convert pre-multiply means that the colors of your image, so all that, is being multiplied with the alpha channel. The alpha channel looks like that. So everything that is opaque is white and everything that would be transparent is black. But here in this area, because of the oversampling, you have some semi-transparent areas. And that is what is causing the problem. But anyway, let's see how we can pre-multiply that. Maybe let me first cut all this with Control left mouse button, and then create a new mix node, and then bring the image in the first input and the alpha in the second input. Now if you look at that, that of course is just the alpha channel, but now if you change the mix node from mix to multiply, then you have this black color in the background, but still you can see the foreground objects. And that is exactly what we want, because now we can bring the movie clip again in the alpha over node, disable convert pre-multiply, bring that in here, look at that, and now we've got exactly the same thing as before, so we can see the background just fine, but still we have this black fringe around the objects. And that is because of the oversampling, as I've already mentioned. So using the multiply node is exactly the same thing as using this button here, convert pre-multiply. So using that button is just a little bit easier than setting up this node. By the way, there's another way of doing the pre-multiplication. So Control X to erase this node, and instead go to converter and then use alpha convert. And you can see here key to premul, and that is exactly the same thing as pre-multiplying by hand or using that button. So when I bring that in here, again, we will have the same result as before. So the image is being multiplied with the alpha channel. And we're doing all this stuff just because we want to get rid of this gray color here. So we want to have a black color in the background and then just alpha overing that over our footage so that we don't get this white color. So this gray color that you can see here is actually the Blender sky or the background. So everything that is just empty here in the background, well, apart from this display of the movie clip, but that is just for the viewport. So everything that is empty here will be filled with the horizon color. And the horizon color can be set here in the world buttons, where you can see here you have the horizon color, and that is the color that is being used to fill the background. So the solution would be to just set the horizon color to black and render again. So now we already have this black color in the background, and when you look at this, everything looks fine, and even this looks okay, so we don't have this dark outline. But why does that work? Well, that is, as I've mentioned, because of the oversampling. So without oversampling, you could use also a pink horizon color if you wanted to, and you would still get no problems. So if I press F12 now, then the background color will be pink, like so. So that is of course not what we want, but if you use the Convert Pre-Multiply button now, again, the colors of the background will be multiplied with the color of the alpha channel. And that is why here you have now, well, correct transparency. But here, around these letters, now you don't have that black fringe. And that is because the alpha channel is now either white or completely black. So there is no semi-transparent area. But when you're using oversampling, then these stair-stepping artifacts that you can see here are sort of being blended together. So when I render with anti-aliasing now, then you won't have that stair-stepping, but some semi-transparent areas. So what's happening during rendering is that Blender will blend also the colors here by taking into account the color of the background. And that is why you get this fringing here, because there are already some colors, and if you multiply them here, then these colors will now also appear in that area. Okay, so the solution is to not render the sky at all. So it is black, and now that is totally correct. So in this case, we didn't even have to change the background color. It has just not been rendered at all. So turning off the sky would be a solution, or a different way would be to go to the shading panel and then switch from alpha sky to alpha pre-multiplied. And that will also give you the correct result, even if you didn't change this sky setting or changed the horizon color. So the pre-multiplication will happen at render time and not after that. So this also looks correct. So now that we've got all this alpha and pre-multiplication stuff up and running, we can take care of the integration. Because currently this doesn't really look integrated at all, and that is because we are missing the shadows. Especially these smooth shadows here that you see here from this diffuse lighting that comes from the back behind the camera. So first of all, we need something that can receive the shadows. And if you use the Set Up Tracking Scene button, Blender will just automatically add a new plane. But since we didn't do that, let's do that by hand. So here on this position right here in the center, I hit Shift S3 so that the cursor is here. And when I now hit Shift A, I can add the plane right there in the center. So now S to scale it up to make it a little bit bigger. And when you render that now, of course, it's no big surprise. Now you have this plane. But that, of course, is not what you want, because we only want to have the effects of the shadows, but not this gray plane. So we somehow have to separate that, and to do that we can make use of render layers. So when we go up here to the render layers, we can first of all call this foreground. So that would be the foreground layer, and currently it will render everything that is available. So that means that if I just enable the first layer, here in my 3D scenes, it will just render that. But if I now also enable the second layer, then both of these layers will be rendered. But since I want to separate that, I can first of all move my background plane to a different layer. And since this is the background, or sort of the underlying plane, I usually move that to the second layer, or actually it's the 11th layer, but just the layer below layer 1. So that one here. And now to separate that for rendering, because if I render now, it will all be available still. So now to separate that, I can assign just the first layer to the foreground layer. So now both layers would be available in my 3D scene, but this foreground layer will only render layer 1. So if I click on render image now, you see we have only the foreground. But because both layers are in principle available for rendering, we have this little problem here, so that the G doesn't receive any light from the lamp that is currently on layer 1. So that is now black. And of course, it should just vanish here in the ground, so we sort of have to cut it off. And to cut that, we can make use of Blender's mask layers. These are here. So if I have something on the background layer here that should cut off something that is on a different layer, I can just assign that layer with the background object as a mask layer, and then it will cut off everything that is here on layer 1 and goes behind that what is on layer 2, on layer 11 in this case. So now the G will be cut off, so that's fine, but still we are missing the shadows. So to get the shadows, we can create a second render layer, background, and then of course not render layer 1 but layer 11, so that one here. And of course this is still looking the same, but if you now assign a new render layer, you can switch that from foreground to background, and now you've got the background plane. The problem is it is just black, and that is because the lamp that we have here is by default only assigned to layer 1. So if you just take Blender's default scene, then the lamp will be only on layer 1. But as soon as you separate foreground and background objects on different render layers, then you also have to make sure that the lamp is living on both layers. So press M, and then with Shift key pressed, also move it to the second layer, so that the lamp is now on both layer 1 and layer 11. And if you look at this here, you can see the active object, which is currently the lamp, is now on both layer 1 and layer 11. So if we render that now, then we will have at least the shaded background plane, like that. Okay, so with that we can somehow try to bring the background into our composite. And for that I will move the foreground render layer down, because usually you first have the movie clip, then the background, and then the foreground, from top to bottom. Okay, so that is why I also move the alpha over down here, and with Control left mouse button drag, cut this line, because first we have to somehow merge the background into the foreground. And that is done by using a mix node, so Shift A, color mix, then bring the output of the movie clip scale node here in the first, and then, well, what do we want to merge? Well, it's something from the background layer, but the image is of course not what we want. So instead we really only want to have the shadow, because that gray area back there is just the effect of the diffuse lighting, so that is not shadow, that is just the lack of light. So to separate the shadow on the background layer, we can make use of render passes. And with the render passes, you can extract the single elements of the render that is then being combined to the, well, to the beauty pass, to the combined pass that you see here. So we can enable shadow, and you can see now we have a different output here, the shadow. And of course, to have the effect of that, we first have to render. So F12. And now by Control Shift clicking on the render layer, we can click until we reach the shadow output. So now we really only have the shadow. So this black stuff here is just the shadow from the foreground objects. And we can now start merging that with our foreground, or with a movie clip actually. But if I Control Shift click on that, you still see, of course, that. So let's not use the image. Let's use the shadow pass, like so. But because it is set to mix, we will now just see the shadow pass, which is of course wrong. So somehow we have to use a different blend mode. And the blend mode that I want to use is multiply, because with multiply, only the dark areas of the image will have an impact, but everything that is white will have zero impact. Because if you multiply something that is white, it will have no effect at all. But if you multiply something that is black, or at least somehow darker, it will just darken the underlying image. And that is because these colors can be also just translated into single values. So if you look at the HSV, hue saturation value, you can use the V, the value or the brightness slider, to just control the brightness. And if you set it to 1, then the value will be 1. And if you multiply any value with 1, it will be just the same value. So if you have, for example, here something that is, I don't know, pink, like 50% pink, and you multiply that with 1, then it will not change at all. So you would have here, for example, the value of 0.3 multiplied by 1, it will still be 0.3. But as soon as you multiply it with, for example, 0, it will then be 0, because 0.3 multiplied with 0 will be just 0. So that is kind of pixel math that you are doing here. So that is why multiplying a black and white image with anything else will have an impact, so that only the dark areas influence the underlying image. So, and that is why we get this effect, because the shadow path is black in the background where you have nothing in the 3D viewport. So if I look at that here, apart from the background image, of course, you have nothing here in the background. That is just empty. And anything that is just empty will be rendered as black. So we first have to somehow fill this up with white color, and luckily we have the information about something that is there and something that is not there in the alpha channel. So here you have the information: white will be fully opaque and black will be fully transparent. And we can make use of that by inverting the alpha path, by using the invert node, and then bring the alpha into the image input here. And when you look at that, that is now just inverted. And now we can add this inverted alpha path to the shadow path output, because here is white, and that is exactly what we need here for the shadow path. So to add that, we use, of course, a mix node, and in fact we are also setting it to add. Because when you add something, only bright areas will have an impact, but when you add something that is black, so that would mean 0, to anything else, it will still be the original value. Because again, when you look at that, if that would be 50% gray, then you have here the value 0.5, and when you add 1 to that, then the result will be 1.5. But of course, if you add just black to that, then you will still have 0.5 plus 0, then of course the result will still be 0.5. And that is why the add blend mode is exactly what we need in this case. So with that we can produce a clean shadow path. And when you now multiply this shadow path with the image, we will have just the shadow. So now that is our prepared, let's say, background image here, and we can alpha over that. So that would be here, and alpha overing the foreground will lead to this result, and that is exactly what we need. Maybe with a little bit less shadow here. Because if you look at the shadow that is produced from this column here in the image, then you can see it is not as black as our artificial shadow. So let's first turn down the factor here on the multiply node, maybe to something like 0.8 or 0.7, and now that is pretty much exactly what we have here. But still, it's not quite right yet, because this is a little bit too dark here, so there would be some kind of diffuse ambient lighting, so that should be not as black as here. And also, especially these letters here are kind of floating still. So something that we are missing is some kind of contact shadow. And this contact shadow is best produced with ambient occlusion. Well, ambient occlusion takes advantage of the geometry in the scene, so it will search for faces that are near to each other and then produce some soft shadowing on that. And to enable ambient occlusion in Blender Internal, so that render engine here, you can go to the World buttons, and maybe let me first turn that down to something dark. So here you can enable ambient occlusion, but then make sure that you don't use add, set it to multiply, because add would add some brightness to it, just like the add mode over here. But instead we want to use some contact shadow, and shadow is always something that is a little bit darker. So switch that from add to multiply. Okay, now before I render that, I also want to enable environment lighting. Environment lighting with this setting, so energy 1 and set to white, would be exactly the same thing as if you would use add for ambient occlusion. So environment lighting uses the same technique, so it uses ray tracing to find out where objects are near to each other, and in these areas then produce shadow, or in the case of environment lighting, it will produce less light. And that would then allow us to make these faces a little bit brighter without even having to add more lamps to it. And something that always works quite good is when you set the energy to 0.1. And then also don't forget to set this back to multiply. All right. Now if I render that, you can see quite a change, and that is not what I wanted, because now everything is just kind of gray and doesn't look really that good. And the reason for that is that currently in the gather method, which describes how the ambient occlusion is working, we have a distance value of 10. And that means that within a distance of 10 Blender units, that then objects would influence each other. Now in this case, I only want to have some subtle contact shadowing here between these corners here, and therefore I want to set it to something like 1 or 0.5. And when I render that, now it is not as dark and gray anymore. Still, I think it could be even less, so maybe 0.3. Yep, and now that is much better. So now this shadowing area is more just there on the corner where the object hits the ground. So we've got some kind of environment lighting. Maybe it could be a little bit more. Maybe let's use 0.2. So we've got that here on our faces, so they are not as dark anymore. Now they are even brighter, which in this case looks a little bit better, I think. But something that we are still missing is the contact shadow on the floor. And of course we are, because the only thing that we are using from our background layer is actually the shadow path. And the shadow path doesn't contain the ambient occlusion. And for that we have to go back to our render layers, and then here in the background enable also ambient occlusion. So now we've got this additional output here, so let's quickly render that again. And now we can make use of the ambient occlusion here, which is a really subtle contact shadow. So it's not really pointing in any direction, it's just there that around these objects, where the objects hit the ground, it is a little bit darker. And since we are also having this problem with the black area here in the ambient occlusion, I want to just duplicate this add node, and I want to duplicate it by keeping this link intact, just to make it a little more easy to work with that. So Control-Shift-D to duplicate instead of just Shift-D, and that will keep these links. So now all we have to do is to replace the input here of the shadow. So bring that in here. Now we've got a clean ambient occlusion path, and we can first, before we multiply that over our footage, we can first combine both of these. So just duplicate this multiply node, bring that down here, and then multiply the shadow over the ambient occlusion. And the reason why I'm doing it in this way is that mostly I want to have more effect of the ambient occlusion than shadow. So if I multiply the shadow on top of the ambient occlusion, then I can control this multiplication with that factor. So here in this output I have just 70% shadow but 100% ambient occlusion, and when I multiply that now on top of the movie clip, I then can set the factor back up to 1 and will still have just 70% of the shadow but 100% of the ambient occlusion. And if the ambient occlusion is now too extreme, I can lower both of these. Alright, and now these letters are not floating anymore, or actually you can see that they are in fact floating, because there seems to be some kind of gap between the letters and the ground plane. So now the ambient occlusion helps us actually to see that we have some kind of problem of the placement. So these are a little bit too high, so just move them down like so, and then re-render. And now they are really sitting there on the ground. Okay, And now that this is working, we can use that with alpha over, but maybe adjust the colors because everything is here kind of reddish. So if we add some reddish tint here to our foreground layer, maybe that would integrate a little bit better. So just drag the RGB curves inside here, go to the red channel and just slightly turn that up. Just here in the middle, just add a little bit of reddish tint to that and maybe make it darker as well, like so. Okay. The only thing that we are missing here, of course, is the undistortion. So before we continue, we can just go ahead and go to Distort, Movie Distortion, just drag it inside here. And now it will fit better to the actual distortion. And lastly, I want to add some vector blur. And the reason for that is that if you have a look at the footage, then at some point, especially where there's some shaking, for example here, you look at that, it really gets quite blurry. So every sudden movement here will lead to some kind of motion blur, and if the CG wouldn't do the same blurring as well, then it wouldn't look correct. So if you render now on frame 189, then you have a kind of blurry image here, but the text is totally sharp. And that, of course, destroys the illusion of the integration here. And to fix that, we can go to the foreground layer, to the render layer, and enable vector. And vector will add another path here in the foreground render layer. And that path, which is now called the speed path, can be used to create motion blur by using a filter. So hit Shift A, go to Filter, and then use Vector Blur. Bring that in here, and the vector blur needs three inputs. It needs the Z, the depth information, and also the speed, and of course the image as well. And if I render that again, then my CG is also kind of blurred, maybe a little bit too much. That's why I want to change that to maybe 75%, like so. And I think that now it integrates much better than before. So let's try a test render with 100%. So here in dimensions, just turn it up. And apart from the lack of textures and lighting, that is already quite good, especially in terms of blur. Maybe the ambient occlusion could be a little bit stronger. So here, just try to set the factor to 1. And yeah, I think that is better. Alright, so now let's render that and see how that looks like.